Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're so pleased to welcome back for part two our guest from last week, Mr. Jess Walder, who's a very prominent writer and author. Among his works, and certainly the one that he's best known for, is Every Knee Shall Bow, The Truth and Tragedy of the Randy Weaver Family, which was a story most of you have heard about in the early 90s in North Idaho. He's also written Citizen Vince in fiction. He's also written Land of the Blind and Over Tumbled Graves. He also has been involved in writing about the O.J. Simpson trial. Our guest also does essays and short stories. I just think he's such a prominent author, and much of his books have been from Reagan Books, which are imprints of HarperCollins, which is one of the leading publishers in America. Our guest from 1986 to 1995 was a very successful reporter for the Spokesman Review when he really got involved with this story of Randy Weaver. I must add that both he and Bill Moreland were Pulitzer Prize finalists along with the Los Angeles Times for their work in that area. So you come to us, Jess Walder, with great credentials, and we congratulate you on your work. And last week we talked, for the viewers who weren't with us, very much about your writing schedule and techniques, but really we got very much involved into the book Every Knee Shall Bow. We haven't quite finished that story, which we will at the beginning of this, and then move on to other works that you've done. With that, I'm so pleased to have Annie McKinley, a colleague in the faculty at North Idaho College in the field of speech, and she's responsible for our guest today being here. And we do work with her, too, on other books that she has that she talks about on this program. With that, Annie, start today's questioning.
Okay. Well, as we talked about Ruby Ridge, and we talked last week about Ruby Ridge and how Ruby Ridge all happened, and we know that Ruby Ridge didn't end with the standoff and didn't end with the trial. As I understand, it went on to a civil trial?
Yeah, well, after Randy Weaver was acquitted of murder and attempting to overthrow the government and found guilty only of failure to appear, and after Kevin Harris was acquitted, they sort of returned to their lives. They did file a civil suit against the government for wrongful death, which was settled eventually. The family got $3.1 million, $1 million each for the surviving Weaver girls, Sarah, Rachel, and Elishaba, $100,000 for Randy Weaver. And even then, some federal agents were furious that Randy Weaver got any. Kevin Harris ended up with about $300,000 for the wounds that he got, which further infuriated some federal marshals because he had, after all, shot and killed a marshal during the initial gunfight that led to the standoff. And after that, the case, except in the Northwest, the case really sort of was on the back burner until 1995 when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City courthouse. Just before that, I had signed a deal to write the book and was working on the book when the bombing happened. But from that point on, everyone wanted to know about these two triggers, Waco and, of course, Ruby Ridge. And that spawned Senate hearings, which opened actually about the week my book came out. And so it was one of the strangest things to be at these Senate hearings, covering them like a reporter that I always was, and to be watching these senators flip through my book trying to find the information. So it was kind of amazing timing, I think, for the book, but it was an amazing time in the country too. We're so wrapped up now in international terrorists. It's hard to remember a time when we were worried about the schisms amongst our own people, about domestic terrorists. But at that time, that was the thing we were the most concerned about.
A footnote, too, before we go on, Jess, and that is that after all this was over with, the Weaver family left Idaho. They don't live here now.
That's right.
You might just give us a little update where they're at today.
Well, Randy Weaver returned to Iowa, invested his money in a car lot, which didn't do well. He and Sarah wrote a book about what happened to them, and he went around to gun shows for a while, signing. He was sort of a hero to the radical right, I suppose, and he would write, Randy Weaver, keep your powder dry in the copies of the books. Sarah Weaver and Rachel and Elishaba actually retired to Montana, where they live quietly. They don't seek publicity. They practice whatever religion and beliefs they want themselves, but they aren't involved in any of those groups. Sarah Weaver married actually a guy who shared her beliefs, who later became an Idaho State Trooper, and they've had children and seem to be doing well. So I think
Idaho or Montana?
Montana. I'm sorry.
Montana.
Yeah, Montana State Trooper. Right. Yeah.
So you got into law enforcement. So there's been some transition in the family.
Yeah, I think I haven't kept as in touch with them as I did for a few years afterward, but they did what all of us do. They said, we choose to believe however we want. We'll keep that to ourselves. But again, they stayed on that side of the line in which, if you don't commit a crime, you shouldn't have anything to fear from the government. So.
And on that too, I believe you mentioned it, that you interviewed Sarah right after the shootings.
I
think
did,
you were
the day
the
after.
only reporter to be able to interview her.
Right, I did. Yeah, the day the standoff ended, I met her in a motel room, and she described for me, the family's version of events, which was really the first time that story had been told. And as I said last week, the thing that struck me was this is a human rights case, and I had gone up there doing what we always do, which is to see groups of people. And the great thing about any human rights case is that it's not about that; it's about those specific human beings. And so that's the book that I ended up writing, and not just on the Weaver side, but also the human beings on the federal government side. So the thing I think I'm proudest of my book is its objectivity. And as a reporter, you can tell if you've been objective because everyone's mad at you afterwards. So.
So you know that you've not sided with either
exactly,
side.
Yeah.
One other question is, and then we do want to go into some other
Sure.
works that you have. This is not your whole
No.
writing career is this one book, but now that you can reflect on it and look back, for you or your readers, what should they take away from this? What is the number one lesson in this whole tragedy, really?
It's funny. I think it's a little bit of a Rorschach test because people read it and the one thing that they realize is that this is not black and white. That there are these shades of gray, and that's what I've devoted my entire writing life to. Because it's too easy to have a set of beliefs based upon dehumanization of people, based upon not looking at the facts. And I think really when people read the book, the thing they take away is that this didn't have to happen, that we need to be vigilant about federal law enforcement, that as citizens we need to we need to do what we can to obey the law and protect our families. But I think the larger point is that the kinds of civil rights violations that we thought we'd taken care of in the 1960s on the far left can happen on the far right. That civil rights are civil rights, no matter which end of the spectrum they're violated on.
With that, let's transition
Sure.
into something else you've done, and that is you've done work on the O.J. Simpson trial, and obviously it got much more publicity worldwide than this particular issue did. But tell us some of your conclusions about the O.J. Simpson trial, how that was different, and what causes one particular trial to get such incredible publicity and another one somewhere else in the country does not.
I co-wrote Christopher Darden's book. He was the prosecutor in the case, and it's funny because of all the books I've written, that's the one people come up to me, and there are people who know that case so well that they know it better than I do. They say, how long does it take to get from Rockingham to Bundy to the two addresses?
They could see it every
involved?
day on TV.
They saw it every day on TV. People flew there and looked into it. I mean, it was a television show, and like any television show, people watched it every chance they got. The main conclusion I came up with was this was not about race, and that's what people think, was that the O.J. Simpson case was about race. The reaction was about race. The fact that for years Black America had said the door had been swinging this way, for once it swings that way, and white America's up in arms. That was very much about race. The black students at Howard University reacting one way, the white people in the Starbucks in Brentwood reacting another way. That was very much about race. But the case was really about celebrity, and it's about what a 24-hour news cycle has done to our country. It's about the fact that if you put cameras in a courtroom, people are going to mistake it for TV. It was about the fact that jurors could look at O.J. Simpson and think they knew him better than they knew their own family because he'd been on TV. I don't think we're done dealing with the incredible ramifications of celebrity on our culture. The Kobe Bryant case is obviously another example, and this will just keep happening. And it's again, for me, it's too bad that this became about race, because we didn't really talk about the issue, which was for me the fact that if you have money and are famous, you have a different set of you get a different kind of justice in America than if you don't.
Well, you have such different lawyers.
You certainly do.
Michael Jackson case is another one, and,
right.
And when you have lots of money, there are certain lawyers, and like all occupations, that are specialists and are incredibly at the top of their
right.
profession, and so you can hire them.
And you throw so much money at the system.
Yes.
And any good defense lawyer will tell you that the longer the trial goes, the better it is for the defense, because they just throw so much at the wall, something has got to stick. And the walls were covered in the O.J. Simpson case.
I have one more question then back
Sure.
to Annie, and that is about the O.J. Simpson trial. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but
Guilty.
Since you've
guilty. Sorry, go ahead.
what did? That's what I was going to ask about the trial itself and the evidence before the court and all. One, did you agree with the outcome? And secondly, why did the prosecution have such a difficult time getting a conviction when? Where did they make mistakes, or was there insufficient evidence? What is your conclusion?
Boy, those are tough issues. As briefly as I can, I would say that it was one of the most overwhelming murder cases you'll ever see. I mean, that blood evidence, if there was a videotape of O.J. Simpson committing the murders, it's more likely that someone who looks exactly like O.J. Simpson would come up and kill those people than the rarity of finding his blood there and her blood here. I mean, it was physical evidence. It was so compelling. They were unable to tell a compelling, convincing narrative to a downtown jury, to a mostly black Los Angeles jury that was predisposed to believe that police cheat, because police cheat, and they had in Los Angeles, and that was the world that they knew. That was a narrative they could follow. The narrative that the prosecution told was interrupted by so much noise and juggling, and again, there was so much noise, so much white noise in that case that the jurors were going to go with the narrative that they knew better. And I think the fact that they were allowed to bring up Mark Furman's what he'd said about race, I think, was one of the things that helped swing the case. But I also think the prosecution made horrible mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was saying was the two most key moments that were defeats for the prosecution was his testimony when he had denied saying those words, and then they proved he had, and the other one was the glove.
I think it was when Judge Ito ruled that they could talk about, that they could ask those questions, was far more important than whatever Furman said on the stand. I mean, I think he, I don't blame him for saying whatever words he wants to say. I mean, most hip hop artists say the same words. But most cops will tell you should not get caught in a perjury trap, which he did. You never say never, because then they show that you did. That said, his whatever he said was as awful as it can be. It had nothing to do with this case, and the fact that it was allowed in, I think was probably the biggest mistake.
Back to Annie.
So I just wanted to jump back to Ruby Ridge for just a second, because I think we might be confusing our viewers, because we keep saying
Well, it was released as Every Knee Shall Bow in 1995.
It was released as Every Knee Shall Bow. Let's show that.
It's available now as Ruby Ridge.
Yeah.
And the reason...
That's right, because I'm sure as you talk more about this, people are going to say, wait, I want this, and I go to my library, and it's...
They're actually both still in print, which
Yeah.
it's a strange position to be in, to be an author that have competing versions of your book in print.
With some change in the title, but still the same.
Well, I went back in 2002 and updated the book. So Ruby Ridge is the newest version. The publisher had when I wrote the book, no one knew about Ruby Ridge, and so it didn't make sense as a title. But it's essentially the same book. There's probably 50 new pages of material in the 2002 edition.
And it also went to screen, did we tell you that?
Yeah, it was made into a miniseries in 1996 starring Laura Dern, Randy Quaid, Kirsten Dunst, and I helped work on the screenplay for that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can we talk about that?
Sure, please.
Okay. I think just as a very talented author, not only does he write great nonfiction, but he writes great fiction. And when I read these books, then I said, what I missed is this man has a great sense of humor that he is able to bring into books like his nonfiction. And I have just finished reading this one because I'm lucky and blessed, because they're going to hold the release of this. We don't know for sure. Is it April now?
It looks like April of 2005, which...
So they brought this book out for citizen events, and I especially liked it because it takes place in Spokane. I was born and raised in Spokane, and for the people in Spokane and surrounding areas, it takes place near Sam's Pit. So for those of you that will fess up to knowing where Sam's Pit is and stuff.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's interesting, one of the reasons I believe that it was held up is because they said there was too many political books released.
Well,
is that one of the theories?
I mean, it was mostly internal stuff with the publisher, actually. Their marketing director wasn't working, and strange and as counterintuitive as this is going to sound, they were getting such great response for the book that they wanted more time to promote it. And if they delayed it a month, then it would get caught up with all the other election books. If they delayed it 2 months, then it gets crushed by all the Christmas books. So they sort of went down the schedule and said, and it's, for me, it honestly, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think fiction hopefully should be timeless. It doesn't, it does, this novel it's about a guy who is sort of redeemed by this simple act of voting. I wanted to write I'd read so many political novels, but they're all about politicians. I said, no one's ever written a novel about a voter, and so, and that sort of minimizes it to say what it's about, because it's also got murder and sex and all the things that hopefully are in good novels, and hopefully great humor too. But essentially that's what I wanted to do, was write a story in which voting becomes sort of symbolic of having a social and cultural life. But they've delayed it, which again doesn't mean anything, except I've realized these books are kind of like 18-year-olds. You still love them, but you think you want them out of the house in college or working.
Yeah.
You hate to get up every morning and see them at the breakfast table, which I have to do with this novel.
Since I just finished, I'll just give it just a very brief synopsis for their audience. That Vince is a criminal. He's on a protection program. He's been sent for witness protection program to Spokane from New York, and he becomes a donut maker. And then he also, I think the kind of underlying thing about
Just
the
don't
voting.
give away the end, because the book will sell better if you don't do that.
Yeah, but the underlying thing is, as a felon, we know that he couldn't have voted, and when he gets this new identity, he gets a voter registration card. So, and I think that as I read it too, I thought just did a wonderful job. First of all, he picked and I want to know, why did you pick the Carter-Reagan election?
Well, a couple of reasons. It's set in 1980, and actually Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan become characters in the novel, which was really fun to write too. First of all, this guy has dealings with the mafia, and if he was in the mafia now, there really is no mafia. I mean, they're far more on television and books than there are in real life. 1980, the mafia was still a fairly decent threat, and also that was I thought that was a transformative election in American culture. We had a complete shift from the Vietnam era, the Watergate era, to a conservative America that I think we are still in. I mean, I think the pendulum is still swinging that way, maybe swinging back. I wanted this person to be at the center of this paradigm shift and to have his one small part in it. There's one of my favorite parts of the novel. He's been told he can go anywhere else in the country that he wants, and he's looking at a map and he's imagining the little borders around the states and the puzzles you had when you were a kid, and you could take those pieces out and you could feel your way around Kentucky, and that little jagged edge was so familiar, and then the smooth part on the bottom. And those imaginary borders are sort of like the imaginary things connecting him to everyone else voting. And in this one act, in that one moment, he connects himself to a one point in history. And again, I've always had this fascination with Jimmy Carter, who was unlike any other president we've elected, certainly in the 20th century, and was, I thought, just a fascinating figure. And he, in a way, I feel like that election almost narrates the story. And I was fascinated to see them talking about the same issues we're dealing with now, essentially Middle Eastern terror. They were dealing with the exact same issues. And we think of history, especially now because the media moves so fast, as happening in sound bites. And to look back and see these long paths of history and to see the way they unfold, I guess that's why I chose 1980.
Yeah. I just think it's great. Some of the things that, too, I also think it's very smart of you to time it in 1980, because then when people would, you know how people do, and they drive down and they see Sam Smith, they go, wait, Sam Smith's not even open anymore.
Yeah, right.
You know, and it's probably an espresso bar or something now, and they're just in there, or that photo shop is still there, or the donut place is still there, but it's kind of like an...
Well, and it also takes place in New York, and one of my favorite parts of the book was to go, I love research. I approach my research for fiction the same way I do nonfiction. So I printed out a 1980 subway map to make sure I got the stops right. I love New York, and the connection between New York and Spokane in this book, I just really love. They're I guess Limerick is Spokane's sister city, but I think of New York in a way because of the shared history, I guess. And to just wander around New York and put yourself there in 1980, it's the great thing that a fiction writer gets to do.
I just think it's also great that this time you kind of wrote from the criminal, Vince is a criminal, basically, where I know from Over Tumbled Graves, you went from the police officer.
Yeah, and it's funny, I don't think of myself as writing mysteries or even crime novels. I write about people who have a great deal at stake, and maybe if I lived in the Hamptons, I would write about wealthy people, but I happen to live in a city that is poorer than most, that has some of the strangest crimes I've ever seen, and again, I when I was finished with the book, I certainly didn't think of Vince as a criminal. I thought of him as one of the most honorable people I'd ever written about.
He's very likable.
We didn't just give away the ending, did we?
And you never know who he votes for. That's a great thing, too.
Oh, no, you just did it. You gave it away.
Oh, no.
He votes, but
maybe
you
she's
don't know
not,
who he votes for.
Maybe she's teasing.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Also, as she indicated, you've written Land of the Blind and Over Tumbled Graves. Would you share with our viewers a little bit about those fictions?
Over Tumbled Graves was my first novel, and it's probably the most traditional crime novel of the three. It's about a serial killer case, and I approached it because I had covered so many serial killer cases in Spokane, so I wanted to write a more realistic novel. I was sort of reacting to the Hannibal Lecter phenomenon, in which the most interesting character in the book was the killer. And having interviewed several killers as part of my journalism, I realized that these are not larger-than-life human beings. They are smaller, diminished people capable of only 2 dimensions of thought, not capable of empathy, for instance. And so that's what I wanted to record. And then you follow the conventions of the novel, and so it's got hair-raising suspense, but it's really, I think my fiction is character-driven. Land of the Blind, my second novel, it is in some ways my favorite. It's the most personal of the three. And I think the funniest. And when I tell people I think it's the funniest, they usually react with horror because I have a dark sense of humor. But it's about a guy who grows up in the Spokane Valley, becomes a successful politician, and then is haunted by decisions he made in his younger life when the kid they all picked on in school comes back into his life, and they get involved in a high-tech company that then leads to some crimes. So.
And you did grow up in the Spokane Valley.
I did, yeah, and Springdale as well. We lived. Yeah. We moved a little bit when I was a kid.
And we should probably give Eastern a little publicity. You graduated from
Eastern Washington University. Yeah.
Yeah, this is home for you. I have a couple of questions I want to deal with concerning. This always intrigues me with every writer. You finish a work, and at least a book. You're constantly writing, I know, but now your next idea of another book. How do you? I've always been so intrigued. How do you come up with a subject, and how then do you develop that story? A writer has to have such an imagination.
Right. Well, and I think I do, and then my children will toddle in, and tell me about their imaginary friends and space aliens, and I think that I'm so rooted to the ground that it's sad. But I think writers, at least the way I work, I'm like a bird, like a magpie. I'm flying around looking for flashy things, and I take them back to my nest. I never know when I'll have enough for a book. I'm working on at any given time 2 or 3 book ideas, some magazine pieces. Citizen Vince started for me 7 years ago. That's when the idea started to form, and then I slowly picked up flashy bits until I had enough to build the nest. And the same thing with the other books. So the novels I'm working on now might not be out for 4 or 5 years. But for me, it's just, I think I fixed the problem of writer's block by saying, write what you want to write. No one ever says they have reader's block. No one ever says, I just can't read, because you read what you want to read. If a novel isn't working, you set it down. And so I'm able to do that. I just set it down and pick up the next thing.
You know what you've done, I've never thought of a writer before. That's always what's great about this program. One sparks one's interest. It sounds like to me that as you're observing everything around you, that many of us in life and preoccupied with certain things that maybe we're not as alive as you. That is, there's so much around us that we just ignore, and you must be constantly watching everything wherever you are.
Oh, yeah.
That you're more open to the awareness of all activity where we might be having tunnel vision and focusing on only part of that life.
That's the great thing about writing fiction is you find yourself, I'll be sitting in a coffee shop, and I do way too much writing in coffee shops. My caffeine level's probably higher than it should be, but I'll hear someone talking about the closing of a house, and I'll think, I will need that detail. I'm going to have a character eventually who sells a house, and this is how, this is how their closing is going, and so, I do think that you end up, sort of with a hyper awareness of things around you. But I mean, I think writers are like anyone else. You can sleepwalk through weeks and not know you're doing it too. There's a cyclical nature to it. But certainly when I'm engaged, it's great. I fill journal pages and napkins.
So even though you're writing fiction, and truly those are fictional characters, but still in a way from real life experiences you're incorporating in that. So there is real life experiences that become part of the novel.
Oh, sure. People always look for you in the characters. And as I said, there's a character in Land of the Blind who resembles me in so many ways. And to me, the funniest thing is by the time I finished the joke, he was the least like me of any character I've written. I mean, others have maybe parts of my sense of humor or, something I've noticed. But you certainly, I think imagination takes you to a certain point, and then at some point you have to imagine being inside the characters, especially if you write character-driven fiction. You have to put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself, what you would do. And I think, as I said, that's the strength of my nonfiction too, is that sense of empathy, that I'm able to put myself in the shoes of characters who normally I wouldn't.
Very similar to an actor playing a part and becoming
right.
almost part of that for a period of time.
Yeah, I think there are similarities.
On that note, we have to bring the permanent conclusion. Jess Walder, I just cannot thank you enough on behalf of our staff, and Annie, thank you for having us introduced to, although I knew Jess already, that these incredible works, that you've had such quality to our program, that I know our viewers over the past 2 weeks have learned so much, and thanks for adding the quality that we so seek in this program. And good luck to you in your future writings. Well, I'm sure that they'll go on to be many others, and congratulations for all the recognition you've received, and especially even in the U.S. Senate when they had hearings and how you contributed to that. Good luck.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, Annie.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been so fortunate to have Jess Walder as our guest the last 2 weeks, dealing with his books, both fiction and nonfiction. And we hope you've enjoyed the program as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.